We explore the history behind engine oils, how we moved from engines full of sludge in the past to engines that remain clean with proper service. We will also share what other drivers are doing to keep their engines sludge-free. Let's jump in. What exactly is engine sludge, and why should anyone who drives a car care about it? Engine sludge is a gel-like deposit that forms when motor oil breaks down and mixes with contaminants like moisture, combustion byproducts, and microscopic metal particles. It sticks to valve covers, oil passages, timing chain galleries, and piston rings. Once it builds up enough, it chokes the flow of oil through the engine, which means metal parts that need constant lubrication start grinding against each other dry. The repair bill on a sludged-up engine can easily hit $3,000 to $5,000, and in many cases the engine is simply written off entirely. This is not a problem that only affects cheap cars or old beaters. Toyota issued technical service bulletins in the early 2000s for sludge problems in their 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder engines. Volkswagen, Audi, and several other European brands face the same issue with their turbocharged direct injection motors. The problem is widespread. It crosses every price point and every brand. However, that sludge formation is almost always preventable. Understanding why requires going back to the very beginning of engine oil itself. Where did motor oil even come from? How did we get from crude petroleum to synthetic blends with dozens of chemical additives? The story starts in the mid-1800s, long before the automobile existed. The first engine lubricants were not engineered at all. They were animal fats, whale oil, and vegetable-based greases smeared onto moving parts by hand. When the internal combustion engine arrived in the late 1800s, early motorists poured in whatever petroleum byproduct they could find, often the same stuff used to lubricate steam engines and factory machinery. There was no filtration, no additives, and no standards. Engines of that era were loud, slow, and constantly seizing up because the oil could not handle the heat or the friction. It was not until the 1920s and 30s that petroleum companies began refining base stocks specifically for automobile engines. Standard Oil, which would eventually become part of ExxonMobil, and competitors like Shell and Texaco started experimenting with different crude oil fractions to find viscosities that could survive longer inside an engine. But even then, the oil was essentially just a slippery liquid with no chemical enhancements. Engines still built up varnish, carbon deposits, and what we now recognize as early forms of sludge. The real transformation came during World War II, when military aircraft engines demanded lubricants that could perform under extreme temperatures and pressures far beyond anything a passenger car would face. That is a fascinating origin, but what changed after the war that made modern oil possible? The military research programs of the 1940s gave birth to the additive package. Engineers discovered that by blending specific chemical compounds into the base oil, they could dramatically extend its useful life and protect engine internals in ways that raw petroleum never could. Detergents were added to keep surfaces clean. Dispersants were introduced to suspend tiny particles of soot and combustion residue, so they could be carried to the oil filter instead of settling on metal surfaces. Anti-wear agents like DDP were developed to form a protective film on high contact areas like camshaft lobes and lifter faces. Viscosity index improvers allowed oil to maintain its thickness across a wider temperature range, which is why you can buy a 5W30 oil today that flows easily in freezing weather, but still protects at operating temperature. Antioxidants were added to slow the chemical breakdown of the oil itself. Every one of these additives exists because someone, somewhere, saw an engine fail and asked why. The additive package is the single biggest reason why modern engines can go on longer between oil changes, whereas engines in the 1950s needed fresh oil every 1,000 to 2,000 miles. If the oil is this advanced now, why does sludge still happen? That is the question that frustrates mechanics and engineers alike, and the answer has several layers. The first and most common cause is extended oil change intervals on conventional oil in engines that were not designed for them. When manufacturers began recommending longer drain intervals in the early 2000s, Many drivers took that as a green light to ignore oil changes altogether. Conventional mineral oil, even with a good additive package, has a limited ability to resist thermal breakdown. Push it past its designed lifespan, and the detergents and dispersants become depleted. Once those additives are gone, every contaminant that would normally stay suspended in the oil starts clumping together and sticking to surfaces. That is the birth of sludge. The second major cause is short trip driving. It is far more damaging than most people realize. When you start your car and drive less than 10 miles before shutting it off, the engine never reaches full operating temperature. Moisture from combustion normally evaporates and exits through the positive crankcase ventilation system. Instead, it stays trapped in the oil. That moisture reacts with the oil and its additives, forming acidic compounds that accelerate breakdown. Do this day after day and week after week, and you are basically brewing sludge inside the crankcase. The third cause is the positive crankcase ventilation valve. If the valve sticks or clogs, pressure and moisture build up in the crankcase with nowhere to go. It is a $5 part that can cause $5,000 in damage. What if people tried to fix sludge once it is already formed? The solutions range from genuinely helpful to outright dangerous, depending on the severity of the problem and the condition of the engine. The most common first attempt is an engine flush product. Typically, people pour it into the crankcase, let the engine idle for 10 to 15 minutes, then drain everything out and refill with fresh oil. The logic is simple. The flush contains aggressive solvents that dissolve sludge so it can drain out with the old oil. In mild cases, on engines with light varnish and early-stage deposits, this can actually work. The conditions have to be right though. The engine must have decent oil pressure, the deposits must be relatively fresh and soft, and the oil passages must not be severely blocked. Where this approach fails, and fails catastrophically, is on engines with heavy sludge accumulation. The solvent can loosen large chunks of deposit that break free and immediately clog the oil pickup screen or block narrow passages in the cylinder head. The result is sudden oil starvation, which can destroy bearings, score cylinder walls, and seize the engine within minutes. Mechanics have seen this happen dozens of times. A customer brings in a high-mileage car with known sludge, pours in a flush product from the parts store, and drives out with a ruined motor. The risk on a heavily sludged engine is extremely high. The second approach people try is switching to a full synthetic oil and hoping the superior detergent package in synthetic will slowly clean things up over several oil changes. This is actually one of the safer and more effective long-term strategies, but only under specific conditions. The engine must still have adequate oil flow and pressure. Synthetic oil contains stronger detergents and dispersants than conventional oil, and over 3 to 5 oil change cycles with shorter intervals, for example every 3,000 miles. It can gradually lift soft deposits and carry them to the filter. The key word is gradually. You are not blasting anything loose. You are slowly dissolving it. This works well on engines with moderate buildup and no warning lights. It does not work on engines that are already starving for oil or showing low pressure readings. The third common attempt is manual cleaning, which means physically removing the valve cover, oil pan, and sometimes the timing cover to scrape and wipe out accumulated sludge by hand. This is the most labor-intensive option and the most expensive if you are paying someone else to do it. For severe cases, it is often the only approach that actually solves the problem without risking sudden blockage. A good mechanic will also clean or replace the oil pickup tube and screen, which is usually the most critically clogged component. What about the folks who swear by additives like Marvel Mystery Oil or Seafoam in the crankcase? This is one of the most debated topics in any car forum, and the opinions are fierce on both sides. Marvel Mystery Oil has been around since the 1920s. It began as a top-end lubricant for aviation engines. People add it to their crankcase oil between changes, claiming it softens deposits and keeps seals pliable. There is some truth to that. It is a light petroleum distillate with mild solvent properties. On engines with very light varnish and no serious sludge, it can help keep things clean. But it also thins the oil slightly, and on worn engines with loose tolerances, That reduced viscosity can lower oil pressure just enough to cause problems. Seafoam works on a similar principle, but it is more aggressive as a solvent. Adding it to the crankcase and driving for 100 miles or so before an oil change can loosen light deposits effectively. The danger is the same as with commercial flush products. If the deposits are heavy, you are playing a high-stakes game of hoping the chunks that break loose are small enough to pass through without blocking anything. There is no way to know from the outside how bad the buildup is, so these products fall squarely into the conditional category. They can help in mild cases and cause harm in severe ones. What are the main camps of opinion on this topic right now? There are roughly 4 groups. The first camp says, just change your oil on time with a quality synthetic, and you will never have this problem. They are mostly right, but they ignore the millions of cars already on the road with existing sludge from years of deferred maintenance or short trip driving. The second camp swears by aftermarket additives and flush products as a cure-all. They point to anecdotal success stories and ignore the engines that were destroyed by the same approach. The third camp says, once sludge is present, the only real fix is mechanical removal, and anything else is just delaying the inevitable teardown. They have a point for severe cases, but they overstate it for mild ones. The fourth camp blames the manufacturers entirely, arguing that modern engine designs with tighter tolerances, higher operating temperatures, and direct injection create conditions that practically guarantee sludge formation unless the owner follows a maintenance schedule that is stricter than what the manual recommends. This group has more credibility than people give them credit for. Many manufacturer-recommended oil change intervals are based on ideal driving conditions that almost nobody actually experiences. Highway cruising at steady speeds and moderate temperatures is not how most people drive. Stop-and-go traffic in extreme heat or extreme cold, with frequent short trips, is far more common and far harder on oil. So, how do you figure out what is actually going on inside your engine? The simplest model that explains most sludge cases comes down to 3 root causes. The first is thermal breakdown from oil that has been in the engine too long. If the oil on the dipstick is jet black and smells burnt, and especially if it feels gritty between your fingers, that is thermal breakdown. The second is moisture contamination from short trip driving. If you pull the oil fill cap and see a milky, mayonnaise-like residue on the underside, that is water mixing with oil. The third is mechanical failure of the positive crankcase ventilation system, which traps blow-by gases and moisture inside the crankcase. If the engine seems to consume oil faster than it should, if you notice oil leaking from gaskets that were previously fine, or if the engine idles rough and smells like fuel, a failed ventilation valve could be the root cause. Thermal breakdown responds well to switching to full synthetic oil with shortened change intervals. Moisture contamination requires changing driving habits, or at minimum taking the car on a 20-minute highway drive at least once a week to cook off the moisture. A failed ventilation valve requires replacement, which is usually a cheap and straightforward job. If you are sitting in your driveway right now, wondering whether your engine has a sludge problem, what is the safest first move? Start with a visual inspection. Pull the oil fill cap and look inside with a flashlight. Clean metal surfaces with a light coating of oil are healthy. Thick, dark, paste-like residue clinging to surfaces is a warning sign. Next, check the dipstick. Fresh oil on a dipstick should be amber to light brown. Dark brown to black means it is overdue for a change. If it looks like chocolate pudding or has visible particles, that engine needs attention soon. If the visual check raises concerns, the safest next step is to drain the old oil, replace the filter, and refill with a high-quality full synthetic at the correct viscosity for your engine. Drive it for 2,000 miles, then change it again. Repeat this for 3 cycles. This gives the synthetic detergents time to work on soft deposits without the shock of an aggressive flush. If after 3 short interval oil changes the oil is still coming out looking like tar, or if you notice low oil pressure warnings, unusual engine noise, or increased oil consumption, that is the signal to stop and consult a professional. At that point, the deposits are likely too severe for chemical cleaning alone, and a mechanical inspection is warranted. Here is what to take away from all of this. First, Engine sludge is not a mystery. It is the predictable result of oil that has exceeded its chemical lifespan, been contaminated with moisture, or been trapped in a crankcase with a failed ventilation system. Second, the history of motor oil is really the history of solving one problem at a time, from raw petroleum to additive-packed synthetic formulas that would have seemed like science fiction 80 years ago. Every advance came from an engine failure that someone studied and fixed. Third, prevention is always cheaper than the cure. Synthetic oil on a reasonable change interval, matched to how you actually drive rather than an idealized factory recommendation, is the single best investment you can make in your engine's longevity. If your car sits for long stretches, or if most of your trips are under 10 minutes, your oil is aging faster than the odometer suggests. Time and driving conditions matter just as much as mileage, and ignoring that is how perfectly good engines end up full of sludge.